What's going on, guys? Welcome back to the Camera Department podcast. I am Taz, your host, and I'm so glad to have you with me. Today's episode, just going to get right into it, I think can really be applied to just about everybody. And upon thinking about what I want this podcast to be and who I want to speak to and ultimately who I want my audience to be, I think I really want to speak to myself when I was first starting out and talk about things I didn't know and try and really help those who are just starting out get better faster. And I was super blessed to be surrounded by so many awesome filmmakers very, very early on. And not just filmmakers, but photographers as well, because film is rooted in photography. That's why it's called a director of photography. They're still using photographic principles in creating their image. So just because maybe a lot of these topics that we talk about may be focused around film or cinematography or videography, whatever term you want to use, you still need to abide by photographic principles in order to create a good image. So ultimately, I was so fortunate to be surrounded by so many awesome people that just poured into me and allowed me to grow very, very fast early on. And while I grew pretty quick, I would say I learned more in a year than I did the previous 3 years. So when I say early on, I guess that's subjective, but I was dabbling around for a little while, and I guess maybe in a future podcast, I'll go into how I got to where I am today and, how I went from shooting with a random Samsung point and shoot camera as my first camera to now working with Reds and Varicams and Alexas and these high-end cinema cameras, and basically the process of getting from point A to point B. And ultimately, I'm not finished. It's not like point B is the end point, but basically how I got from the beginning to where I am now. And all that to say, I would love to help pour into people the way I was poured into. And that might seem a little rudimentary to some people. It might seem very basic and dumbed down, I guess, if you want to say that. But I don't think this podcast is necessarily going to be for the seasoned filmmaker. It's not going to be for the guy who's been around for 20 years in film and TV and has done so many different things. I might bring on some of those people, but ultimately, I think the goal of this podcast is to help those who are just starting out or maybe early on in their career with leveling up. Like I said, today's podcast topic is basically how to just take better pictures, how to get a better image out of whatever you're taking your pictures or video on. And when I say pictures, like I just mentioned a little while ago, it still does mean if you are taking video, how to take better video, how to get a better image from whatever you're doing. So whether you are someone who's just taking photos on their phone to someone who has maybe an entry-level camera and they're just starting out and they're learning the ins and outs of it. And these are just a few things that I learned later than I would have wanted, but I think I still learned it pretty early on. So if you're just starting out, this is going to be one of the better podcasts to listen to in terms of learning the basics of your image and how to get something that's quote unquote cinematic. So here we go. Let's just dive into it. The main thing I wanted to talk about here it has to do with lighting. It doesn't even have to do with your camera. So a lot of people think, oh, what camera do I need to buy? And while that's a really good question, a better question is, how do I light my subject? How do I light my scene? And when I say scene, you don't have to think of like a movie scene. You just think of, okay, well, I'm taking a picture of somebody and maybe it's outside and you're just working with the sunlight. How do I position them to get the best looking image possible with just what you're working with? So like I said, if you're just running around taking pictures of your kids, you can place them a certain way in natural light to get the best photo. And basically what I learned here is using a term called short side lighting. And it contradicts a lot of what you think early on, because short side lighting basically means putting the light to the side or even behind your subject. So it's not directly in front of them. The light isn't directly in front of them, lighting up their whole face. And I'll get into that in a second, but it's actually turning them around. So it's you, the subject, and then the light behind the subject. And it doesn't have to be directly behind, but it should be on the more or less opposite side of your camera. And what this does is when you backlight or side light your subject, you start to create what's called a contrast ratio. And the easy way to think of a contrast ratio is the difference between the light side of the face and the dark side of the face. So you'll notice here a light is coming in and hitting me from the right side of my face. And then it's not as light on the left side of my face. So what that does, it starts to create shape. It starts to create dimension. It starts to create depth in your image. So now you are able to see more characteristics of the face. You're creating shadows, which actually help create a more robust and cinematic image. If you're lighting somebody directly from the front, they're gonna be evenly lit. But and with that, you are not going to see depth in the image. So that's really tip number one. The biggest tip that I could give somebody is adjust your lighting. Work your lighting to create a cinematic image. And I guarantee you, if you are watching 95% of movies, if there's dialogue between two people, and once you see this, you can't unsee it, you will most likely notice that light, that the director and the DP have placed a light somewhere to the side of them. So the light is coming in from the side and wrapping around their face and creating a light side, and then gradually more to a dark side. Now, the contrast ratio depends on the mood. So if you have a fairly, I'm not going to say fully even contrast ratio or a low contrast ratio, meaning, okay, it's pretty light on this, it's light on this side, but it's still kind of light on this side. It's a very like even tone. It's not going to be super moody. But say you're interviewing a serial killer, and then you have a really, really light side of the face and almost a pitch black side of the face. So then you're creating a really high contrast ratio image, giving you much more tone, giving you much more moodiness. And that moodiness and that contrast ratio really dictates how your image feels. So if you want it to be really tense, yeah, you might want a high contrast ratio where the light is maybe coming from behind them and one side of their face is lit up and the other side isn't. And a classic example of this is like in Star Wars with Anakin. He has a light side of his face and then a dark side of his face. And that's telling a story of like the struggle between light and dark and his internal struggle with, the Force and then the dark side and being a Jedi or being a Sith and all that stuff. And you'll notice that if people are struggling in movies, they might use really heavy shadows to convey that feeling. So ultimately you're creating a feeling when you're determining your contrast ratio. So all that to say that when you are running around taking pictures of your kids, or you're on vacation and you have your point and shoot that you grabbed for travel and you just want something simple, just because you have a simple camera doesn't mean you have to have simple pictures. So if you ask any photographer what time of day they like to take photos, if it's an exterior photo shoot, they will probably say golden hour. Golden hour is that time, the hour right before the sun goes down, where the sun is really low, because what that allows the light to come in from the side and it creates a wrap around the face. So you have that light and then you have the shadow and it creates really, really nice photos. And you notice with portraits, most portraits will have a light coming from one side of the face and it'll gradually get darker. Not saying super dark, not saying pitch black, but you will notice a difference between the lighter side of the face and the darker side of the face. And ultimately that's what's creating the depth and the shape of that person's face, because the human eye, it does really desire to see depth and understand where things are in space. And if things are super evenly lit, then the eye is going to have a harder time determining, okay, well, that's that in the image, and then that's the other thing in the image. And subconsciously, you're thinking about this. You're not consciously thinking, okay, that's where this is, but that's what your eye is telling your brain, and it's trying to understand where things are. And same thing with focus. Whatever's in focus, your eye's going to be drawn to whatever's in focus. So with lighting, going back to lighting, it's very important to use that lighting to your advantage. So with that being said, I've kind of gone off on a bunch of little rabbit trails here, but if you are taking photos and the sun isn't directly overhead, that's pretty much the worst time to take photos, in a lot of people's opinions. Some people love working with it and they can work with it and they know how to, but either you want to think of where the sun is in the sky. If you are taking exterior photos, which a lot of people, with that hopefully I want to reach with this podcast, are not using a bunch of lights. They're not setting up a set and taking the time to say, okay, I want this light here. I want that light there. Okay, I need you to stay there. I need you to turn a little bit here. It's just, hey, pose for a photo, click, boom, done. So what you can do is, if that sun is, let's just say between, 8 a.m. to 10:30 a.m. and then, whenever sunset is, an hour and a half to 2 hours before sunset, where that sun is a little bit lower in the sky, what I recommend is putting that sun either behind your subject or to the side of your subject. So wherever you're taking the photo, say I'm looking directly at the camera here, I would want the sun coming from the side. I don't want the sun to be behind the camera. Okay, so it's lighting me up fully. You can just turn them here or turn them here. You'll see how my face, even in this, if you're watching visually, you'll see how the shadows change on my face based on where I'm looking. So if I'm looking directly at the light source here, yes, my face is going to be fully lit. But if I look the opposite direction, so I'm looking away from the light, you'll see a darker side of my face right over here. And that's ultimately what you want. And again, dependent on the feel you're going for, you will turn them more, turn them less, see how the light changes on their face as you turn them. So I definitely recommend to those of you who are just starting out or think, I just have this basic camera, to challenge yourself to look at lighting a little bit differently. And the biggest thing when it comes to creating a good image, whether you're in photo or whether you're in video, is master your lighting. I can't stress this enough. Like I said at the very beginning of the podcast, so many people ask, what camera should I get? What camera is best for this? And the best camera is the one you have on you. It doesn't matter if it's your phone or a little point and shoot or a $5,000 mirrorless or a $30,000, cinema camera. Whatever you have on you and whatever tool is best for that situation, that's it. Like, for example, I'm not going to vlog with a red camera. It's big, it's bulky, it's not geared towards that use case. But at the same time, I'm not going to bring a little point and shoot onto a high-end film set, because that's just, it's not the right tool for the job. So you have to pick your tool, and ultimately the lighting is going to dictate the image that you get. Because if I turned all these lights off, what are you going to see? You're not going to see anything. It's going to be very, very dim. It's not going to look good. So ultimately, you have to understand that lighting dictates your image. And the better you light something, the better it's going to look. I have seen people take $30,000 cameras on purpose, and to prove a point, and make it look like a $500 camera, and vice versa. You can take a $500 camera, light the scene or light your subject really, really well, and make it look like a $30,000 camera. And so it goes so much into knowing your basics. And lighting, we can go into lighting on another podcast and really how to light your subject, and 3-point lighting and different types of lighting scenarios. But yeah, ultimately it goes back to lighting your subject. If you're at Disney taking a photo with your family and it's a little bit later in the day, yeah, try and put the sun to the side of them, or maybe like 45 degrees coming in, so you have a lighter side of the face and it slowly wraps around their face and it's getting a little bit darker. So And then, we can go into visually what looks good behind the subject and how to compose your scene. And that's another thing. Composition is figuring out visually what's interesting in the area that you're taking your photo. So whether that's, an interior in somebody's home or an exterior in a yard or on a sports field, or, there's so many different scenarios. You want to create something that's visually interesting. You don't necessarily want to put somebody up against a flat white wall when you have a beautiful field on the other side, or, but whatever. So composition is another thing that we could probably go into in a future podcast. But I think the main point I want to hit in this podcast, in this episode, is just lighting. So learning your lighting and playing around with different scenarios that give you a different feel. So in addition to lighting, another huge thing that is so crucially important is learning camera basics. So learning exposure basics. So this means learning how aperture works, learning how ISO works, learning how shutter speed works, and learning how all of them work individually and how they affect how your image looks, but how all of them work together to come together and create your final product. So I'm just going to go through these really quick for those that may not know. So aperture. Number one, aperture is basically the size of the hole. So if you think of the size of the hole in your lens that lets light through to hit your sensor. So that is measured in like an f-stop on cinema lenses. It's called a t-stop. They're just measured slightly differently. But basically, the bigger the hole, the more light's going to come in and let light hit your sensor, and the brighter your image is going to be. With that, also, you get what's called a shallower depth of field. And basically, that is just depth of field is the field of what's in focus. So if your aperture is wide open, so that means it's the hole is as big as it's going to get on that specific lens, and you're letting a lot of light in. That means you're going to have a shallow depth of field. So whatever's in focus, you're going to get like whatever, it's going to be blurry in the background, it's going to be blurry in the foreground. So if I'm in focus here, there's my hand right now. If you're watching, is out of focus, and my hand behind me would be, I might be a little bit more in focus since the wall's right behind me. But if there was no wall behind me and I was in a living room and the kitchen was behind me, the kitchen would be out of focus. So vice versa, if you close down that lens, it's another term for like making the hole smaller. You're going to be letting in less light, so your image is going to be darker. But what comes along with that is you have a deeper depth of field. So there's going to be more in focus, which is really great for, like, let's just say you're shooting street photography or landscape shots where you want everything in focus. You're not shooting a portrait where you want the subject to be separated from your foreground and your background. You want everything to be in focus. So that's something you have to keep in mind as you close down that aperture. And when you're looking at the numbers, this always confused me early on. The lower the number, the wider the aperture, and vice versa. The higher the number, the lower, like the smaller the hole, basically. So keep that in mind. If you have a lens that goes down to 2.8, that's going to be faster, and that's another term, faster. A faster lens is a lens that has a wider opening. Okay, so faster equals wider, slower equals smaller. And it's going to be faster than, say, you have a lens that has a f4 minimum aperture. Now, a lot of prime lenses, and prime lenses, we're going into like so many other things here, but prime lens is just a lens that doesn't zoom. It's a fixed focal length. So you might have like a 16, a 24, or 35 millimeter, or a 50 millimeter, or any of these fixed focal length prime lenses that usually will have a lower f-stop than a zoom lens. So a lot of portraits are taken with maybe between a 50 millimeter f1.8 and an 85 millimeter f1.8. So they're going to have a shallower depth of field. It's really going to pull that subject off the background. It's going to create that separation. So that's number one, aperture. Number 2, ISO. ISO is basically your camera sensitivity to light. And this is measured in a value, let's just say between 200 or 100 if it goes that low on your camera. And it can go up to like super high, like 52,000, if not higher. Some cameras have a really, really highly sensitive sensor. But basically what that does is it allows you to create more sensitivity on your sensor. And the higher that number goes, the more sensitive to light your camera is going to be, and the brighter your image is going to be. Okay, so if it's a little bit darker, say you're inside and there's not a whole lot of light, you need to bump up your ISO. You can do that, but the trade-off, just like we talked about trade-off with aperture. So like when you have a really wide aperture, you're going to have a shallow depth of field, and vice versa. With ISO, the higher ISO goes, you can't just like bring it up infinitely and make your image brighter, because what happens is you start introducing what's called noise or grain. You'll notice this if your camera has, let's just say, a base ISO of 800 and you go up to like 2000, 2500, 3200, you'll notice that the darker parts of your image especially will start to begin to show, like it'll start like looking fuzzy, and that's what's called grain. So ISO is good in terms of giving you a higher sensitivity sensor, and I don't even know if that's the right way to say it, but we're going to go with it. A more sensitive sensor. There we go. But you can't push it so high that you start introducing grain. Now you can use noise reduction software, in Lightroom, or if you're using Final Cut or Premiere or Resolve or whatever you're editing in, you can use the software to bring that noise level down, but it's not always ideal. So you want to be very conscious of what your image looks like when you're taking the photo, not pushing your ISO too much. That's really it with ISO. We can go into like more stuff. Some cameras have dual native ISO or dual gain output, or basically things to help reduce the amount of noise at higher ISOs. Okay. So third thing, shutter speed. I almost forgot. Shutter speed is basically how fast or slow your shutter opens to take a photo. And that's measured in seconds. So you can be 1/60, which is 1/60th of a second. You can be 1/8000, which is 1/8000th of a second, which is super fast. And there are use cases for all of these. So I'll just give you like a really brief overview. The slower your shutter speed, the longer your shutter is going to be open. It's going to let more light in, to hit the sensor, and the brighter your image is going to be, and vice versa. If your shutter is opening up really fast and it's only open for 1/8000th of a second, you better have a lot of light, because it's not going to be letting any light in. So keep that in mind if you are shooting sports outside and you want really crisp images because they're moving really fast. You have to make sure you capture them in what they're doing. You're going to want a faster shutter speed, but it's also going to decrease the amount of light that's coming in. So that's another thing with, it's not just light, it's the amount of motion blur that you're going to get with your image. If you have a slower shutter speed, imagine, it's not going to be an exact 1-to-1, but you're opening and shutting your eyes. And, obviously a camera sensor is not as sophisticated as the human eye, but the whole time that sensor is open, it's gathering information from your environment. So if your sensor opens and your subject moves across your frame and then it closes, it's going to capture that whole thing. So you're going to see your subject here and you're going to see your subject here. And not on screen, if you're watching this visually, basically think about it coming across the screen the whole time, and you'll see just like a blur of a person, which can be a cool effect if you're going for something more creative. But if you're just taking, normal photos of your kid at football, playing a football game or whatever, dance, or where your subject is moving fairly quick, you're going to want a fast shutter speed so you don't get that blurriness. Especially, you also notice the blurriness in the hands when hands move, or feet, or if your face is moving side to side. So that's the balance you're going to want to have when you're taking your photo of how fast of a shutter speed do you need. Okay, if your shutter speed is this fast, this is how much light is being let in. Okay, this is the aperture I need to let in enough light. Okay, well, if I still need more light, then I need to bump my ISO. Okay, well, if it's still too dark, I don't want to bump my ISO so much that I start introducing grain. So can I open up my iris anymore? Can I slow down my shutter speed more? Is my subject moving too fast for this shutter speed? You can see how all of these start working very, very closely together. I think it's called the exposure triangle, because on 3 points of the triangle, on each point you have, one, you have your aperture, you have your ISO, and you have your shutter speed, and all of these work together to create your image that's inside the triangle. And as you take different subjects, if you're taking a portrait, your subject is not moving around a whole lot. So you don't need to worry about having a super fast shutter speed. And therefore you can get away with something a little bit lower. You don't have to bump up your ISO because you're not having a quick, really fast shutter speed, and you're not getting any light in there. So you're having a little bit of a slower shutter speed. Therefore, you can keep your ISO a little bit lower. You can keep your iris a little bit more wide open if you want. And all these things. And then comes an ND filter if you're shooting outside. Now this is just literally an endless road. And I'll go into I'll do another episode of like, what is an ND filter and how do you use that and what's the use case for it. So yeah, I really think recapping on this episode, we'll wrap it up. We're getting to about, I think we're coming up on half an hour here. So I really can't stress enough the importance of lighting and lighting your subject to match the mood you want to convey. And maybe those of you who are starting off, who are just starting off and very early on, you're like, okay, well, I don't really care about the mood. Well, if you keep progressing with your photography and you take it a little bit more seriously, and who knows, maybe you're just a hobbyist, maybe you're just recreationally taking photos of your family, but you still want good photos to look back on. Like, why are you taking photos if they're not going to be good? So even if it's just going to stay in the family, you're not posting them, you still want good photos that your family can look back on and just enjoy. So ultimately, mood, yes, you want to keep in mind the mood that you're trying to convey. If it's a lighter mood, if it's like a darker mood, if it's a more moody vibe, like let's just say maternity photos or pregnancy photos. Those you enjoy a little bit of moodiness. You enjoy the shadows, putting them up next to a window and having like the light wrap around their face and, things like that. So, number one, lighting. Number two, which really is number one because you have to master your camera settings and how to use your camera before you really dive into lighting. But they're just they really go hand in hand because your camera settings determine the lighting that you need and all that. So if I don't stop right now, I'm going to keep going down a really, really long rabbit hole. So I'm going to stop right now. I hope you guys enjoyed this episode. I almost said video. I'm used to YouTube. Apologize for that. So I hope you guys enjoyed this episode. Please leave comment below with any thoughts, any questions. I'm not the expert in this field, but like I said, ultimately I just want to help those starting out, help them improve in whatever capacity they want to improve in. And if you have aspirations from, you're just starting out, you want to be a big name DP or director, great. If, like I said, you're just taking photos of your family on vacation, that's awesome too. We can always do things better. And that's ultimately what my goal is, I think, with this podcast, is to help you get better in whatever you're trying to do. So, like I said, I hope you guys enjoyed this episode. Please let me know your thoughts, any questions you might have, and I'll see you guys in the next one.